Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Now, after such a scorching heat wave, it's good to have a respite and a little bit of ice cream to help us recover. I hope those of you who haven't gotten your ice cream, just stay online and keep getting it and then join us. Speaking of temperature, in the late 1880s, Lord Kelvin, he's the guy who measured the temperature of absolute zero, said, and I'm going to paraphrase, you can't improve what you can't measure. And that surely applies to the topic that we have at hand today, poverty, and particularly child poverty. So I thank you for taking time out of your busy Capitol Hill schedules, those of you who are interns and those of you who are staffers, to talk about this important topic, which is drawing a line, how we measure poverty and why it matters. So, in case you don't know who I am Erica Groshen. I'm a member of the Senior Extension Faculty for the Cornell ILR School, and I'm the former commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, so I'm very much into statistics. Today's event is sponsored by the Population Association of America, which you'll hear over and over today referred to as the PAA, so that's what it means, Population Association of America. It's a professional association comprised of over 3,000 population scientists. That includes demographers, sociologists, and economists who are conducting research on the individual, societal, and environmental implications of human population change. So that's the mission of the PAA. And these members conduct interdisciplinary policy-relevant research with direct and indirect support from federal research and statistical agencies, including, for example, the National Institutes of Health, the National Center for Health Statistics, the National Science Foundation, the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and others. So today's briefing focuses on a very timely topic for all of us, the practical and policy implications of altering the current poverty measures. This is something that people are talking about a lot right now on the Hill, considering it. So our speakers are going to address three important issues relating to this. The current measures, so what are the current measures, and what are the implications of possible changes to those measures? They're going to discuss a recent National Academy of Sciences report that's called A Roadmap for Reducing Childhood Poverty, which Tim is lifting up over there, and you can get a copy of. And they'll also be talking about how changes in poverty measures affect policymakers' ability to analyze trends in child poverty. And our three distinguished speakers, starting here is Connie Citro from the National Academy of Sciences in the white jacket, Bob Moffitt in the center. He's Johns Hopkins University, and Tim Smeeding of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the speakers' complete bios are in your folders. If I were to read through them, we probably wouldn't even have any time left of our hour. So those are for you to read. Before I go on, I want to thank our congressional sponsor, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney and her staff. They sponsored and supported the event. And then I get to list a few housekeeping matters. First of all, speakers are not here to express or advocate for specific policies. Any positions that they may express, because they do have positions of their own, any that they do express are their own and don't necessarily represent a position by the PAA. Now, all of you have copies of the slides in your folders, and I understand that the PAA is going to be posting them on the web, on its website. So the final thing I want to mention, almost second last thing I want to mention, is that we're holding all of our questions to the very end. The speakers only have 13 minutes each, and they're being timed, and I'll be brutal with the timing, so there will be time for Q&A afterwards. And if you're using Twitter to communicate about today's briefing, our hashtag, we have two hashtags, hashtag PAA Briefing 2019, and hashtag Poverty Matters Measure. Poverty measures matter, but all of those without spaces. Okay. So now, thank you for your attention, and I'm going to turn the podium over to Bob Moffitt.
Okay, thanks, Erica. And let me get situated here. Yeah, okay. Well, happy to be here, and I'm sorry so many of you have to stand. I hope after it's all over, you'll decide it was worth it to come and stand for an hour, but we'll have to see what you think at the end. So this is on drawing the poverty line and a number of issues related to it. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University. Came over from Baltimore, the great state of Maryland. I won't spend 15 minutes talking about that. I could. But I have also done a lot of work over my career on welfare programs, poverty measurement, and things related to that. So I'm always happy to talk about it. So as Erica said, implied, I think, my task as the first person here is simply to walk you through as fast as I can how we currently measure poverty. The Census Bureau puts out a number every year for an annual rate of poverty. Where does that come from? What is history? How does it calculate? Why is it we care about it? And things like that. After me, Connie Citro will talk, and she'll talk about particular issues that have been proposed to change the poverty line. Actually, I'll talk a little bit about that too, suggest some other kind of things that have been suggested to change it. So you'll get a little bit of flavor, which I'll start, and then Connie will continue. Okay, so first of all, we do have a poverty line, as you all know. One of the interesting things about history is that the U.S. is one of the first ones to even have one. And in fact, most countries today do not have an official one in the sense of the government publishing one. And the U.S. was the first, 1963, a long time ago. That's one of the issues. We did it in 1963, and we haven't really changed a lot since then. But anyway, at the time, we were very innovative to even think about the government defining a poverty line. So it goes quite far back. So I'm going to talk about 5 things. I'm going to have to be brief because I only have a few minutes here. My slides will be posted later if you want to. If you didn't pick up all this as I go through it. Number 1, how do we actually measure it? Number 2, what is it used for? And why is it important to know why it's used for? Third, what have been the trends in poverty using this measure that we use, the U.S. government uses? Fourth, what are the problems? And there's been a lot of discussion over the years about issues with it, lots of proposals for improving it, and I'll list those, and then finally I'll talk about alternatives that are proposed that try to solve those problems I mentioned in number 4. Okay, so number 1, how do we measure it? First of all, just to start at the very basic here, if you never even encountered the definition of poverty, it's really simple. You have to first define a line, a threshold. You have to say, okay, you've got to have this amount of income to be able to purchase the minimum amount of all those goods out there that we think are necessary for a minimum standard of living in our United States. So you have to define that threshold. Secondly, you have to get some data on how much income people actually have. And third, the really simple part is you just, let me see here. And the third part is, after you get that data, you simply compare people's incomes to the line and say, well, you're poor if you don't have that much income, and you're not poor if you have above that income. And I'll show you some numbers, and just like a couple of slides here on what that number comes out to be. What percentage of individuals in the United States have an income which is below the line that the U.S. Census Bureau has set. Okay, so the details really quickly here. How does the Census Bureau actually define that poverty line that they're going to compare people's incomes to? Well, it goes back to 1963. That's when it started. And it was kind of an interesting idea because it really should be built off some kind of a notion of what the minimum amount of goods you need is, okay? Now, in 1963, what they decided was we're going to use food. And you build everything off of that. What's the minimum amount of food you need? So they went to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, and they said, nutritionists, tell us how much the minimum amount of minimally nutritious food you need to lead a healthy life, a minimally healthy life. And the nutritionists, God bless them, gave us some numbers on that. And then we said, okay, how much does it cost to buy those particular goods? Add them all up, go to the grocery store, what are the prices of all those minimally nutritious goods? Added them all up and said, okay, here's the amount of money a family needs, and it depends upon the number of children and everything. But anyway, they came up with a number. Here's the amount of dollars you need to buy that minimally sufficient diet. And then the people who were doing this poverty line looked at some data, and they saw the U.S. families roughly spent about 1/3 of their income on food. So after they got that the cost of that minimally sufficient diet, they simply multiplied it by 3. They said, well, if you have this amount of income, and you're like the average family, you spend 1/3 of your income on food, well, you'll be able to afford this minimally sufficient diet. So that was the way. It was a very simple calculation and built upon this idea of a minimally sufficient lifestyle, but just the food part of it. And that's how they did it. Again, I'll give you some numbers on that later. They just multiplied by 3. We still are using that exact same poverty line here, 50 years later. The only change we've made is for inflation adjustment. Of course, as the prices of food go up, you need more, and prices of everything go up, you have to have more dollars to buy it. But that is, and Connie will talk quite a bit about the details of how you do that. But the idea is very simple. As prices go up, sure, you need more dollars. But the point is, conceptually, the poverty line, even today in 2019, is supposed to be the amount of money you need to buy that same 1963 bundle of minimally sufficient diet, over 50 years ago, okay? That's what you're supposed to buy. Okay, so that's the way, the only thing it's been adjusted for. It's called the official poverty measure, the OPM, and I'm trying not to use too many initials here because there are a lot of acronyms here, and you'll hear some more like SPM and OPM, things like that. But the OPM is what people call the number, the measure we use now. And so finally, here's a number for you. What is it today, at least in 2018, for a family of 3, about $20,000. So I asked you all, can I go home to Washington, to your homes here in D.C. and think, if I were a single mom with 2 kids, could I live on $20,000? How would you do $20,000 a year? That's like $1,600 a month. What's your rent here? I mean, anyway, think about it for a minute. But that's a number. Keep that number in your head. That's kind of where the line is today, on average. We'll talk a lot about the issues here. Okay, so what is the actual number for what percentage of people have incomes below that? And the answer is that today, 12.3% of all U.S. individuals are poor. That is to say, they're living in families with incomes below that $20,000 or whatever the line is for their families. 39.7 million people. It's a big number, and that's why a lot of us care about it. Among children live in families with lower incomes on average than single individuals and childless couples. And among families with children, 17.5%, or about 13 million children, are in families with income below that poverty line. Okay, so that's the quick overview of what it is, what numbers we have for poverty today, and how it's calculated. Why is it important? Well, first of all, the interesting thing about it was that once the U.S. started publishing this number, people cared, and we want to track it, and we're trying to get it down. So just as a measure of social kind of achievement in our society, everyone cares about it. But that's not the only reason it's important. Another reason is, believe it or not, is that number is used on a lot of federal programs to decide how much money in terms of grants to give to states and localities. And if you're in a state or locality that's getting money from education, Department of Education for schools, or you're getting, everybody has a Medicare prescription drug program, and the feds give, and Congress gives money to the states and localities for that. Community development block grants, there are about 40 grants in total. And by the way, I can give you URLs for all those grants. There's lots of stuff written listing them. You want to know your state, look it up. And you change and those are the formulas, the amount state and locality get is a function of the poverty rate. And the higher the poverty rate, the more money you get. So one of the issues here is you start changing the definition of poverty, it's going to change the dollars that every state and locality is getting in very complicated ways. It's not maybe something conceptually that you need to say, well, one day we're not ever going to change it again, but you have to at least work it out. And it's a first order of importance to all states and localities in the United States. Second thing is a lot of programs like the SNAP program, which is our food stamp program, Medicaid, CHIP, which is our Children's Health Insurance Program. So all of those programs use the official poverty line to define who's eligible for a benefit and who's not. If you change the poverty line and now you're going to lower it somehow, as some of the people have proposed to do, a lot of fewer people are going to be eligible for those programs. Or a lot of people are going to lose their benefits. People's incomes are below where the poverty line started at and where you've lowered it to. So these are very important practical issues in addition to just caring what it is. Okay, so what have been the past trends? Number 3, given the way we define it. And here it is. And don't have a pointer here. So I'll try to speak loudly. 1959 to 2017, the poverty rate was about 23% back in the earliest. We started in 1963, but they did it a few years back, starting in 59. Started out 23. We had tremendous progress against poverty all the way through about 1975. It dropped down to about 12%. But the amazing thing is, since today, 2017, it's still 12%. It's gone up and down, but still kind of no change. That's very disturbing because we've made a lot of efforts with our social safety net to reduce that rate. Okay, so here's the answer. Well, there are problems with that measure. Number 1, today people spend a lot less than 1/3 of their income on food. Let's say it's 1/4. We then need to multiply by 4 to get the income to get that minimally sufficient diet. That's not even the most important one. This is the important one, which is that food is important, but so is everything else. You need to define the amount of minimum expenditure to rent an apartment. Housing is very important. We have a problem with affordable housing in this country. You've got to define that, a basic need for housing. And clothing, you want to clothe your children. You need to decide how much money you need for that. You need enough money to buy a decent standard of health care. That's an interesting one I can talk about in Q&A. And so on. You need to go through everything and not just use food, because you need income to buy all the necessities of life. So that's a critique of our current one. It doesn't do that. This is also extremely important. The current measure only counts the cash income a family gets, and it doesn't adjust for any of the in-kind transfers they get. If you get food stamps, that's not counted as part of your income. You get Medicaid, that's not counted. You get subsidized housing, it's not counted. So that's going to be important for why it doesn't look like we're making much progress. For, let's see, many other problems. I think I missed one here. Yeah, the cash income. Oh yeah, the tax credits. It also doesn't take into account after tax credits. If you pay taxes, that lowers your income. That's not taken into account at all in the official poverty measure. And also, if you get a credit like the earned income tax credit, that's not counted. So anyway, lots of other problems. Are there alternative measures? Yes. There was in 1995, the National Academy suggested one. The Census Bureau has adopted a modified measure of it. It's not the official poverty line, but it's one that many researchers prefer because it addresses almost every one of those problems I mentioned before. It bases your poverty line not just on food, but how much you need for food, clothing, housing, utilities. It also adds all those transfers like food stamps and subsidized housing. It also adds tax credits and takes into account your after-tax income. It also makes geographic cost of living. I skipped that a minute ago. Believe it or not, the official poverty line makes no distinction whether you live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or Manhattan. They use exactly the same poverty line, which everyone agrees is a problem. It also takes into account kind of work expenses like childcare, which I can talk more about it. Now, if you use this alternative measure and you look at the trends in poverty over time, that blue line is what you get if you use this alternative measure that the Census Bureau has been computing since 2011, and you can project it backwards, and you get much more progress against poverty. That's because you're including all these social transfers, tax credits, SNAP, everything that have grown so much, and that's greatly reduced poverty. So it matters a lot how you define the poverty line. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Citro.
Yes, thank you. I've been actually asked to focus specifically on the issue of updating poverty thresholds, how and why it matters, and the role specifically of an inflation index that Robert mentioned. Because the issue is, once you have the poverty threshold set, like for 1963, what to use going forward? It wouldn't be realistic or fair to do nothing. Prices do typically rise. The official poverty measure, the OPM, uses the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, the CPIU, which is the flagship index produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the one you see in the media every month. Because it adjusts just for inflation and not also for the fact that living standards have increased, it's called in the field an absolute poverty measure. Okay, is there a better way to do this? And the reason I was asked to talk about this in some detail is because the Office of Management and Budget issued a Federal Register notice last May that said, why don't we use a different inflation measure to adjust these OPM thresholds? Why would this matter? What effects would it have on poverty rates and program eligibility? And why did they just ask about making this one change and not fix everything that's wrong with the official poverty measure, as we heard from Robert? Here's the list of all the other inflation indexes that are out there that OMB asked for comments about. Most of them were produced by BLS. One of them is produced by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The ones in bold there, I'll be talking about a little more later. You can ask me about the others later. I think it's important to understand how inflation is measured, and I call it sausage making. The goal is pretty straightforward. It's to measure price change for as consistent as possible a set of goods over time. But this turns out to be quite complicated. You have to first decide which goods are you going to include in the market basket and how much weight does each get. Housing right now is nearly 40% of the CPIU. Because things change, we're great at consumer innovation in this country, you have to decide when do you ditch old goods like rotary phones and when do you introduce new goods. Similarly, where you measure prices enters in. When do you ditch old outlets and add new outlets? And BLS uses a bunch of surveys about what people buy and where they shop to make these decisions. But there's yet more complications. You'll get a good, like an automobile, and you might think it's the same thing, but maybe they've added some bells and whistles. My personal favorite is the rear vision mirror in cars so you don't hit the post in the parking garage when you back up. Well, the amount of the price change for that car that BLS has to estimate is due to that new feature really shouldn't count as inflation. It's a quality adjustment. You also have to determine what kinds of substitutes. People are pretty rational in their shopping decisions. Say you love galas, apples, but the price is going up. Well, you decide, okay, Fuji's are still reasonable, I'll buy those. Similarly, you could substitute oranges for apples or Metro for driving to work and vice versa. And without allowing for this kind of substitution, the market basket would look pricier than it really is, assuming that families aren't willing to go to the mat because to have gala apples no matter the price. You have to decide how to chain your inflation index for this kind of substitution, like Metro for driving. Currently, the flagship CPIU does this substitution every 2 years. There's something called a chained CPIU, which adjusts every month. BLS again uses a bunch of surveys, other data, research to make these kinds of decisions. And over time, it's made improvements in the CPIU, which has implications for the poverty thresholds. Most of these changes have lowered measured inflation. In 1983, for those of you old enough, I don't think anybody here except myself maybe, I remember there was a housing boom over inflation, and BLS changed from asking people how much is your house worth on the market to ask how much rent could you get for it. And in 2000, they started to do this every 2 years, cross-category substitution. It used to be done on a much longer interval. Okay, if you'd had these changes from the get-go, then the OPM thresholds would be lower. I won't go into the intricacies of this graph, but just look at the right tail there. The blue line, that's the OPM. It's up there at $24,858 for your 2-adult, 2-child family. The other two, the CPIU research series, which incorporates all these improvements in the CPI and casts them backwards, and one that's very popular with economists, the personal consumption expenditures deflator that BEA produces. You get lower thresholds today. So you might think, no brainer. OPM asks, the OMB asks, why shouldn't we use a different measure? And maybe we should, because the CPI still is believed to overstate inflation. Other indexes substitute less expensive goods more often and introduce new goods more quickly. And historically, the chained indexes don't increase as fast as the CPIU. Now, these look like minor differences, but they accumulate. What about counter arguments? Well, there's evidence that low-income households face higher prices than higher-income households. They spend more on housing, particularly rent. And rent's been, really increasing more than other things that are in the CPIU market basket. They can't substitute as readily as higher income households. They're in shopping deserts often, dollar stores. Also, retailers are catering a lot to higher income people, including with price breaks, and not much caring about people who are consuming who have less income. More counter arguments. These chained indexes are often introducing the latest whiz-bang thing, like the newest type of laptop, into their index fast, catching the falling prices that have characterized computer goods. But who out there with very little money is buying the latest whiz-bang, laptop? They are not. The PCE, which economists like a lot, doesn't give as much weight to housing as it needs to for what consumers face, and it includes some items that consumers don't actually buy. So if we wanted another index, a better approach could be developed something, and I made up this name, you won't find it anywhere else. This is the CPI-LI, base one on low-income household spending patterns, what they buy and where, and what goods are readily available to them. Okay. What did this 1995 NAS report, which I was involved in, have to say about this whole issue? Well, it said completely redo the OPM, and that eventually gave us this new supplemental poverty measure, which uses food, clothing, shelter, utilities, and it updates the thresholds, not with an inflation measure, but by the changes in spending on those items. In the field, that's called quasi-relative, because spending at necessities tends to rise at a slower rate than all spending, but faster than price changes alone. Some countries use a completely relative updating measure. They just look at, say, 1/2 median household incomes. So why would you update poverty thresholds for changes in living standards, which is going to give you higher numbers rather than lower numbers over time? Because poverty's always relative to time and place. Just look around the world and back in time. In 1940, 45% of US households lacked indoor plumbing versus only 7% in 1970. And informal poverty lines that people were developing on their own prior to 1963, in fact, were lower than that 63 threshold. The 60s was a boom period in our economy where all boats literally were lifted, and the statisticians said, well, why don't we update those 63 thresholds in real terms? But the Budget Bureau, predecessor to OMB, vetoed this because it had become tied to food stamps, and they didn't want to spend any more money on food stamps and other programs. Okay, this is a graph. Again, you can ask me about it later, but it's from the NAS report. The main thing to note is there's a vertical line, that's 1963. The horizontal line is the OPM threshold in constant $1992. And you can see that before 1963, two other measures would have given you a lower threshold, and after, they'd have given you a higher threshold. One of those is the half of median after-tax family income, and one of them is called a subjective poverty threshold. It's when you ask people, and this has been done, Gallup did a whole series for years, what they think is the minimum income to get along, and you do some statistical analysis, you can work out thresholds that the population actually thinks make sense. So the real issue, it seems to me, is this long-term use we've made of an absolute poverty measure. 55 years is a really long time to maintain poverty thresholds just for price change, and not also adjust for the kinds of things where we saw, 40% indoor plumbing down to 7%. And a switch to one of these price indexes that would measure lower inflation would lead to even lower poverty thresholds and eligibility for SNAP and other programs. It would really make a big difference. And some researchers have calculated, well, what if a different index had been used since 2000 for the official poverty measure? And they estimate we'd have wound up, depending on which index, with 1.6 million to 1.9 million fewer poor, and presumably fewer people eligible for SNAP, Medicaid, CHIP, you name it. Here, just to underline the point, is when you use a variety of different measures and compare them to the 63 food-based OPM, you get, as a percentage of that, thresholds that are much, much higher. If you did food times something today, the second one, we actually spend about 1/7 of our income today on food. You'd get a much higher threshold than the OPM, and this again is today, or 2016 when I had all these numbers. There are a couple of subjective ones based on what surveys have said. There's a relative one. United Way has something called a household survival budget. I picked Iowa, and theirs is quite a bit higher. And similarly, this supplemental poverty measure, when you make some conversions for comparability, is similar to these higher numbers. So every other method of estimating a poverty threshold today, starting today, is a good deal higher than what we have now. So the NAS report said, when you have a new poverty measure, revisit it and improve it every 10 years, not let it sit around for 50+ years. And the president's budget actually proposes funding for such a review. I would argue that review also should look at the continued usefulness of the OPM, and if we decided to switch to the new measure for, say, programs, you could start with a threshold, percent of the thresholds. My final statement: it makes no sense to change the price index for updating the OPM thresholds, particularly when the assumption going in has been, oh, let's pick one that measures lower inflation. We need a full-scale review of that issue, all the others, and the effects it would have on the people who depend on social programs in this country to maintain at least a minimal standard of living. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. How you doing? I'm not going to talk about poverty measures. We're going to start with one and figure out what can we do to reduce it. I'm going to talk about a National Academy of Sciences report that I was involved in, and Robert and Connie too. And we were asked to provide a roadmap for reducing child poverty, and so we did. And I'm going to quickly go through some of the things we did. First of all, it's important to know these weren't just economists. You can't just allow economists to do this. You need policy people, child welfare people, people in medicine, developmental psychology. A lot of people were involved. Here are their names. Most of them are members of, a great majority of them are members of the National Academy of Sciences. They're all incredibly good people. There's some good conservatives like Ron Haskins and Don Winstead on there. It's not just commie pinko lefties like Irv Garfinkel. I won't say me. I'm middle of the road, okay? Anyway, we worked hard for 2 years, and Suzanne Lemenstrel is there, who's our study director, and we produced a report. And here, there are 3 things we're supposed to do. Okay, we're supposed to review research on linkages between child poverty and well-being. We did that. I'm not going to talk about it. There's uncontrovertible evidence, conclusive causal evidence that a little bit of money makes a big difference in terms of child well-being and family well-being. There's no question about it anymore. The causal evidence is in. If you have a kid who's trying to grow up below the lines that we were talking about, that kid's not going to do as well. Not going to do as well in school and so forth and so on. First thing, we nailed that. Causal evidence, it's done. Second thing was provide objective analysis of poverty reducing effects of major assistance programs. And yeah, we made some progress, just as Robert showed you. Not enough, but we've made some progress once you look at the programs that work. And the third thing I'm going to talk about today is we're supposed to provide policy and program recommendations for reducing the number of children living in poverty and deep poverty by half within 10 years. And that's what I want to talk about. You start out with a line, what are we going to do to make it better? Which, as Robert said, everyone agrees. How we're going to do it, there's some disagreement. Everyone wants to do something to help kids get out of poverty. Okay? So, here's our instructions. Use that supplemental poverty measure. Number one, we had no choice. Use the SPM. Have the Urban Institute simulation people have a model they call TRIM3, which includes adjustments for underreporting of programs and so forth and so on. Use TRIM3 to do your estimates. And then TRIM3 got about 98% better because all the behavioral responses were done by Hilary Hoynes and Robert Moffitt, and they should have paid us for those because those are the best people in the world who can know how to do that. Mm-hmm. So we took account of the way the programs affect work and other sorts of things. So today we're going to concentrate on the third task, recommendations for programs and policies. So we started out with 20 individual policy and program options, and we ended up with 4 packages. Okay? We decided which ones we wanted to do based on the following criteria. What's the strength of the research and evaluation evidence that this actually reduces poverty? How much does it reduce it by? How about high-risk subgroups, single parents, minorities, Native Americans, and so forth? What does it cost? We're not blind Pollyanna. It costs money. And then the impacts on work, marriage, opportunity, and social inclusion. So we took all those into account. Okay? Now here's the list of the programs and policies that we looked at. We used 2 alternatives for each of these. Okay? Expand your earned income tax credit. Everybody loves that. Not for single people. Why? Because single people are only indirectly related to kids. This had to do with kids, so it was increasing the current earned income tax credit. Expand child care subsidies. Child independent care, child care subsidies. Raise the federal minimum wage, not to $15 an hour. I am no fan of 15. Forget it. You walk into Wisconsin, you get shot. The median worker in Wisconsin makes $17 an hour. We're not going to 15. But we could go to $10.50 nationally, or $11 like Minnesota next door to us has. Everyone should be able to do that. Okay. Now this is you're getting my opinion here, but this is part of our conversation. Okay. Implement a promising training and employment program called Work Advance. That's the best results from the Manpower Development Research Corporation. So what if we gave people more training, and how would that affect their work and their incomes? You could modify existing programs in their relationship to immigrants. So we could turn back immigration laws to allow more immigrants to participate like they used to in programs. It's important to note that even in our baseline poverty measure, 20% of poor children in our country are U.S. citizen children with a Social Security number, born in this country, living in a family with an immigrant parent or grandparent. So this is an important group. Okay. You could modify existing programs. We could expand SNAP, the food stamp program. You remember from November 2009 to November 2013, there was a temporary increase to the value of food stamps because it was recession. Suddenly in November 2013, poor people don't need to eat as much anymore, so we cut it back. We did, I don't know. Okay. Expand housing choice voucher program. We could expand the housing voucher program. Or we could expand the supplemental security income program. Those are existing programs. And then we looked at 2 policies that are used in other countries. And the one that you'll hear the most about is replacing our current child tax credit with a fully refundable universal child allowance. Call it child tax credit, a child allowance, make it refundable, pay it monthly. 3 steps. All the other rich countries do that. Canada's is at 400 a child a month. Okay. So we have all these things, and we said, okay, what are they going to do for us? And here's the deal. The vertical line is where you have to get to. That's the goal of having child poverty, a 6.5 percentage point reduction from 13. And guess what? None of the individual programs get you there. No one program. There's no silver bullet. There's no one thing you do and bang, you end up with your result. So it needs more than that. Now what we did find is, you can see that some came closer. The child allowance programs came closer. We got some out of housing vouchers, SNAP, and so forth. So we decided, well, okay, if one program isn't going to get there, what's an optimal way of putting them together? Now before that, to be guided, we found out that more effective policies generally cost more. Okay? So the child allowances are the most costly. SNAP is up there, EITC, and the other ones don't cost a lot, but they don't give you a big anti-poverty effect either. Okay? So there's a relationship. Right? The other thing we found out, we looked at policies and their effect on employment especially, and we found that all of these programs or policies affected employment. Some of them, if you increase SNAP or you increase the child allowance or a housing voucher, you would have a small reduction in work. Those are the ones below. But a lot of the other ones increase work and by a lot more. So expanding the EITC, the child care tax credits, and work advantage program all had big positive effects. So, hey, what if we put these things together? Duh! Here we go. So we had 4 program and policy packages that we costed out and recommended. Why do you need packages? Because poor people have multiple needs. There's workers and non-workers. Okay? Some people need food, housing. They all need some cash or some child care. And you get different effects from different programs. So put them together. That's the way to go about doing it. It also allowed us, by putting these programs together, it allowed us to take a program like SNAP or the child allowance or housing, which reduced the number of people who went to work, okay, and put that with a program that had even a bigger effect on employment. An employment and training program, a child care program, and expanded EITC. Okay? So that was the trick. And I'm going to talk about the programs right now. So the first one, essentially, is we call a work-oriented package. Okay? We expand the EITC. We expand the child care tax credit. We increased the minimum wage, and we rolled out Work Share, Work Advance. This is the program of MDRC, okay? The good news, 1 million more people go to work. That's good. Other good news, only costs less than $10 billion, 8.7. But it only reduces poverty by 18%. That's nowhere near the 50% line that we wanted to get to, okay? That's the facts. So work alone is not going to solve the problem. Repeat that after me. Work alone will not solve the problem. Thank you. The message is received. You're going to get A's on your quizzes tomorrow. I see a couple of my students out there and others. Okay. All right. We looked at a second program that just took a few of the elements. It expanded the earned income credit. It expanded the child care tax credit, and it began a child allowance. Now you might think child care tax credit, earned income tax credit, child tax credit. Hey, isn't there a bill that just passed the House Ways and Means Committee that's HR 3300? Yeah. What's it got in it? The same 3 elements. A little bit different. We can talk about it in discussion, but the same 3 elements. So the child care tax credit and the earned income credit are to increase work, and the child allowance is to put a floor under everybody. And the floor is the same as the child tax credit that everyone gets right now, the people who are middle income and above, $2,000 per kid. So essentially what this would do would take $2,000 per child. It would allow you, if you wanted, to take it monthly, and it would give it to everybody whose income is below the current cutoff. So it would go all the way down to 0. That's 1/3 of all kids would be getting this. Okay? Now you put that one together, you didn't get a half. You still didn't get a 50% reduction in poverty, but you got more than 1/3. Okay, 41% reduction in deep poverty, which is also good, and 560,000 more people went to work. And this one cost $44 billion. sort of a middle cost. Okay, so we have those two. They didn't quite make it. One is sort of a bargain basement that looks a lot like what people are thinking about in the building here, and the buildings. And the other one is work alone. Now, here's two packages that got us there. Okay, the last two packages both have expanding the ITC and expanding the child care tax credit. The universal one, the last one, also increases the minimum wage to $10.50 an hour. Okay, but the means tested one expands SNAP and public housing to get us there. And when you put that together with the rest, you still get 400,000 more people working. You get a 50.7% reduction in poverty, but it costs you $91 billion. Okay? If instead of expanding SNAP and housing, you put in a bigger child allowance, $2,700, okay, a year per child. You began something called child support assurance, which means that if an absent father can't afford to pay the full child support amount, that the public brings it up to what he should be paying, to the minimal amount. Okay, that's small cost, but it does apply to a number of them. And we brought the immigrants all back in. When we did all of those, that cost $108 billion. $108 billion, more expensive. Got 600,000 people more going to work. So the last two read our goal, but the other ones work too. So here's the lessons from the packages are that individual policies and programs don't do it. Different poor families need different solutions. But if you bundle work-oriented programs with income support programs, you get less child poverty and more work effort. Both were things that we thought were really important. I firmly believe that the long-term solution to poverty is work, and it's a job that pays enough to feed a family. But low-income people aren't getting those kinds of jobs in this economy. They don't get the hours, they don't get the wages, they don't get the benefits, and it's going to take a while to get there. And in summary then, you can say that it's an attainable goal. We can reduce child poverty the way that England has and the way that the Canadians have. Canada, by the way, has a $400 per child allowance right now. Okay, we can do that. The costs are high, but we also looked at the costs of child poverty, which have been estimated in a couple of journal articles between $800 and $1.1 billion. So it's a bargain if you want to reduce the costs. But also we have some packages and programs that cost less and have significant impacts on poverty. And we don't want to throw them out. You may not have the stomach or the money to afford the full goal, but there's packages in there that can help us get part of the way to where we wanted to go. You can find out more. You can get the full report. Suzanne is sitting out there. They answer your questions. You can go to This Is Fun. This is a user-friendly site. You can find out how many poor people are in your state and stuff like that. Those of you who are working for various congressmen. I got a few more things here, but I'm going to stop right now and say thank you very much.
Okay, so we have about 9 minutes for questions.
Have more ice cream.
Right. Okay, and I see one right here.
So I